To mock her, a millionaire instructs his black maid to greet his international guests, assuming she'll struggle. Instead, she impresses everyone by speaking fluently in multiple languages. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The grand ballroom of Tyler Hastings' Manhattan mansion gleamed under crystal chandeliers, each one worth more than most people's annual salary. The space buzzed with the quiet murmur of New York's elite, hedge fund managers, tech entrepreneurs, and old money heirs, all dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns that could fund a small business. Tyler Hastings stood at the center of it all, his 6'2" frame commanding attention in a custom Tom Ford suit. His perfectly coiffed silver hair and stern jawline gave him the appearance of authority that his billions had taught him to expect. He gestured with his crystal tumbler of aged scotch, directing staff members with sharp nods and curt instructions. The European-style reception was meticulously planned, from the string quartet playing soft classical music in the corner to the strategic placement of influential guests throughout the room. Modern art pieces worth millions lined the walls, carefully selected to demonstrate both wealth and supposed cultural refinement. Waiters in pressed black uniforms wove through the crowd with silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Lyla Johnson stood near the entrance, her hands clasped together to stop them from shaking. Her crisp black uniform had been pressed twice, and she'd spent extra time ensuring her hair was perfectly neat. This was her first major event as the new head of household staff, a position she'd earned through years of dedication and hard work. Tyler's voice cut through her thoughts like a knife. "Ah, Lyla," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Do try to pronounce the hors d'oeuvres correctly this time. We wouldn't want our guests thinking we picked you up from some street corner in Harlem." His laugh, meant to sound jovial, carried an edge of cruelty that made several guests shift uncomfortably. Lyla's spine stiffened, but her face remained neutral. The weight of her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "They'll try to shame you, child. But shame slides off a strong back like water off a duck." Her grandmother had worked as a housekeeper too, but had spent every spare moment reading to Lyla, teaching her that education was the key to breaking cycles of prejudice. As Tyler walked away, satisfied with his display of dominance, Lyla observed the party around her. The guests laughed too loudly at weak jokes, touched each other's arms with false intimacy, and exchanged business cards with practiced smoothness. Every interaction was a transaction, every smile a negotiation. In the kitchen, between directing staff members, Lyla allowed herself a moment to remember her grandmother's tiny apartment in the Bronx. The walls had been covered with books in different languages, gifts from the professors she'd worked for over the years. "Knowledge doesn't care about the color of your skin or the size of your bank account," her grandmother would say, teaching Lyla French verbs while cooking dinner on their secondhand stove. The memory gave her strength as she returned to the ballroom. Tyler was holding court near the fireplace, surrounded by a group of men who laughed on cue at his jokes. His eyes followed Lyla as she moved through the room, expecting, perhaps hoping, to see her fail. The night was young, and the air was thick with expectation. Servers circulated with fresh trays of champagne. The quartet transitioned to a new piece, and conversations flowed like the expensive wine being poured. But beneath the polished surface of wealth and privilege, something else was brewing, a tension that would soon reshape the carefully constructed hierarchy of Tyler Hastings' world. The party shift, Ted into full swing as Lyla began her rounds through the crowd. Her movements were precise and professional, each step calculated to blend seamlessly into the background while remaining attentive to guests' needs. The crystal glasses clinked, and the soft murmur of sophisticated conversation filled the air. A tall man with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses approached the refreshment table where Lyla was adjusting a flower arrangement. "Excusez-moi, et séduise à distinct parisien accent. Pourriez-vous m'indiquer où se trouve la salle de bain?" Without missing a beat, Lyla responded in flawless French, "Bien sûr, monsieur. Prenez le couloir à droite, c'est la troisième porte à gauche. Si vous voulez, je peux vous y accompagner." Her pronunciation was perfect, her grammar impeccable, and her tone carried the subtle warmth of someone who had spent significant time in France. The businessman's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and a genuine smile replaced his previously practiced social expression. Votre français est remarquable. Où avez-vous appris? He asked, genuinely intrigued by her mastery of his native language. Their conversation attracted the attention of nearby guests. The soft murmur of party chatter began to dim as more people turned to watch the exchange between the service staff member and the French businessman. Lyla explained, still in French, about her studies at the Sorbonne during a year abroad, speaking with the confidence of someone who had earned their knowledge rather than inherited it. Tyler, who had been boasting about his recent yacht purchase to a group of investors, noticed the shift in attention. His story about the custom Italian leather seats trailed off as he realized his audience was more interested in what was happening across the room. The French businessman was now introducing Lyla to his colleagues, completely forgetting the social barriers that were supposed to exist between staff and guests. The scene unfolding before Tyler was not part of his carefully orchestrated evening. He watched as Lyla seamlessly switched to English to include other guests in the conversation, her voice carrying the perfect mix of professionalism and charm. The French businessman was now explaining to others how rare it was to find such perfect pronunciation outside of native speakers. More guests gravitated toward the growing circle around Lyla. A woman in a Chanel suit exclaimed, "Tyler, you never told us your staff was so accomplished." The comment struck him like a physical blow. He wasn't used to sharing the spotlight, especially not with someone he considered beneath his status. The quartet's music seemed to fade into the background as the party's focus shifted. Lyla had become the unexpected center of attention, handling it with a grace that made Tyler's earlier condescension look even more inappropriate. His carefully planned display of wealth and influence was being upstaged by the very person he had tried to humiliate. Tyler's hand tightened around his scotch glass as he observed the scene. The French businessman was now exchanging business cards with Lyla, something that simply wasn't done with household staff. Other guests were asking her questions about her education and experiences, treating her as a peer rather than a servant. The power dynamic he had relied on was shifting before his eyes. His mansion, his party, his guests, everything that usually reinforced his position at the top of the social hierarchy, suddenly seemed less impressive compared to Lyla's natural ability to connect with people through genuine knowledge and skill. As Tyler stood there, watching his carefully constructed world begin to tilt on its axis, he couldn't have known that this was only the beginning of the evening's surprises. The whispers among the guests had already started, comparing Lyla's refined presence with his earlier crude behavior. His reputation, built on wealth and intimidation, was about to face TS' greatest challenge. The evening progressed, and Lyla's unexpected display of sophistication continued to ripple through the party. She now stood among a group of captivated guests, sharing stories about her childhood in the Bronx that somehow managed to bridge worlds that rarely intersected. Her narrative wasn't one of poverty porn or self-pity. Instead, she spoke of determination, education, and the power of human dignity. "My grandmother taught me Italian while cooking Sunday dinners," Lyla explained to an enthralled audience. "She learned it while working as a cleaner at the Metropolitan Opera House." She then smoothly switched to Italian, demonstrating yet another language in her arsenal. A prominent opera donor in the group clapped in delight, immediately engaging her in a discussion about contemporary Italian composers. Tyler, now nursing his third scotch of the evening, watched as his guests, people he'd spent years cultivating relationships with, gravitated toward Lyla like moths to a flame. Each new revelation about her background seemed to further diminish his carefully constructed facade of superiority. A German industrialist joined the growing circle around Lyla, and to Tyler's increasing discomfort, she effortlessly switched to German, discussing the philosophical works of Hegel and Nietzsche. The industrialist's wife touched Lyla's arm warmly, expressing admiration for her insight into European literature. "Remarkable young woman," commented Harold Wellington, one of Tyler's most important European investors, who had appeared beside him. "She reminds me of my daughter, studied at Oxford, speaks 5 languages. Though I dare say your Lyla might have her beat." The use of your Lyla made Tyler wince internally. She wasn't his possession. That was becoming increasingly clear. Wellington wasn't finished. "You know Hastings," he continued, swirling his brandy. In today's global market, this kind of cultural intelligence is invaluable. The ability to connect across languages and cultures. He let the sentence hang meaningfully. Perhaps you could learn something from her approach. The suggestion that he, Tyler Hastings, could learn anything from his housekeeper felt like a slap in the face. Yet he couldn't ignore how his guests' respect for her grew with each interaction. They weren't just being politely impressed, they were genuinely engaged. Another group of guests had gathered around Lyla, this time discussing her volunteer work teaching English to immigrant children. She spoke about educational inequality with an authority that came from lived experience, not theoretical knowledge. Several of Tyler's business associates were taking notes on their phones, apparently inspired by her ideas about community development. The contrast between Lyla's authentic connections and Tyler's usual transactional relationships became painfully obvious. Where he threw around money to impress, she offered genuine insight. While he boasted about his achievements, she spoke of collective progress and community uplift. Wellington's words continued to echo in Tyler's mind as he observed how Lyla handled each interaction with grace and humility. She wasn't just showing off her abilities. She was using them to build bridges between people of different backgrounds, something Tyler had never considered important until he saw how effectively it could be done. The evening was slipping away from him, and for the first time in years, Tyler Hastings felt like a stranger in his own home. The carefully maintained power structure he had relied on was crumbling, replaced by something he didn't fully understand. And as he would soon discover, this was just the beginning of his education in true worth and dignity. Tyler retreated to his private bar in the corner of the ballroom, a spot usually reserved for his moments of triumph during these gatherings. Tonight, however, it felt more like a fortress of solitude. He poured himself another SC. Och, this time not bothering to maintain the pretense of moderation that usually characterized his public persona. From his vantage point, he could observe the entire room, a view that had always given him a sense of control. Now, that same view served only to highlight how thoroughly he'd lost command of his own party. The usual clusters of people that would form around him had reorganized themselves around Lyla, who was now seated on one of his expensive Italian leather chairs, holding court like a natural-born leader. A burst of genuine laughter erupted from her group. Not the polite, restrained chuckles that typically punctuated these events, but real, heartfelt amusement. Lyla had just delivered the punchline of a joke in what sounded like Mandarin, causing a Chinese tech mogul to double over in appreciation. The man's wife was wiping tears of mirth from her eyes, careful not to smudge her perfectly applied makeup. Tyler took another sip of his scotch, letting the expensive liquid burn its way down his throat. He'd spent years cultivating these relationships, carefully maintaining an image of superiority and exclusivity. Yet here was Lyla, dismantling his carefully constructed hierarchy in a single evening, armed with nothing but knowledge and authentic charm. His reflection in the bar's mirror caught his attention. The confident smirk he usually wore had been replaced by something unfamiliar: uncertainty. He looked older, suddenly more vulnerable. The perfect Windsor knot in his tie felt too tight, and his custom suit seemed to hang differently on his frame, as if his very presence had somehow diminished. "She's quite extraordinary, isn't she?" A voice interrupted his brooding. It was Diana Chun, the CEO of a major tech company, who had apparently broken away from Lyla's admirers to refresh her drink. "You must feel fortunate to have someone of her caliber on your staff." The word staff hit Tyler like a physical blow. Just hours ago, that word had carried such different connotations. It had meant someone beneath him, someone whose very presence was meant to enhance his status. Now it felt hollow, almost embarrassing. He watched as Lyla gracefully navigated between different groups, switching languages effortlessly, making connections between people who would normally never interact at these functions. She wasn't just serving his guests anymore. She was elevating the entire evening in a way he never could. The realization struck him with unexpected force. He didn't really know anything about the people who worked for him. How many other hidden talents, how many other remarkable stories had he dismissed simply because of his preconceptions? The thought made him uncomfortable in a way that all his wealth couldn't soothe. His empire had been built on the assumption that worth was measured in dollars and influence. Yet here was Lyla, commanding respect not through material wealth or social position, but through something far more substantial, something he was beginning to realize he might lack entirely. As the evening continued to unfold, Tyler remained at his bar, simultaneously observer and outsider at his own party. The scotch in his glass offered no answers, and the growing knot in his stomach suggested that his world was about to change in ways he couldn't control. The conversation near the grand fireplace had turned to business opportunities in emerging markets. Normally, this was Tyler's territory, a chance to boast about his international investments and connections. Instead, he found himself watching from the periphery as Lyla engaged with a group of serious-faced executives. The real opportunity isn't just in market expansion, Lyla was saying, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who understood both statistics and streets. It's in sustainable community development. When you elevate local education and entrepreneurship, you create lasting economic growth. Several executives were nodding particularly Marcus Chun, a venture capitalist known for his ruthless investment strategies. He'd rejected 3 of Tyler's recent proposals, but now he was leaning forward, completely engaged in Lyla's perspective on microfinance initiatives in underserved communities. The traditional top-down approach often fails because it doesn't account for local knowledge and needs, Lyla continued, citing specific examples from her own community. She outlined an innovative framework for combining profit with social impact, something that made several investors pull out their phones to take notes. Tyler found himself moving closer, drawn by the practical wisdom in her words. She wasn't just speaking theoretically. She was describing real opportunities that he, with all his market analysis and expensive consultants, had completely overlooked. The key is creating sustainable cycles of growth, Lyla explained, sketching a diagram on a napkin. When you invest in education and local business development simultaneously, you create an ecosystem of opportunity. Her model was elegant in its simplicity, yet sophisticated in its understanding of human nature and economic principles. The napkin was passed around the group, attracting more attention than the elaborate presentation folders Tyler had prepared for the evening. Jonathan Warren, a conservative old-money investor who rarely showed interest in new ideas, was asking detailed questions about implementation strategies. This could work in the Bedford-Stuyvesant area, Lyla suggested, naming the neighborhood near Tyler's latest development project. There's already a strong community foundation there, and with the right support, she outlined potential returns, both financial and social, with the precision of someone who understood both spreadsheets and street-level realities. Tyler felt a strange sensation in his chest as he realized that Lyla's proposal could actually save his struggling development project, the one that his top advisors hadn't been able to fix. The community resistance he'd been fighting might turn into community partnership under her approach. Ms. Johnson, Marcus Chin interrupted, using an honorific that Tyler had never once employed. Would you be interested in presenting this framework to our investment committee? We've been looking for innovative approaches to urban development. The offer hung in the air like a challenge to the established order. Tyler watched as other investors nodded in agreement, already seeing the potential in Lyla's vision. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was emerging as a potential business leader in her own right. The realization hit Tyler. Lyla understood something fundamental about value that he had missed in his decades of wealth accumulation. She saw opportunities where he saw obstacles, connection where he saw competition, and strength where he saw weakness. As the group continued their discussion, Tyler remained on the edge, experiencing for the first time what it felt like to be the outsider looking in. The power dynamics in his mansion had shifted so dramatically that he felt like a stranger in his own home. The business discussion had reached a critical point, and Tyler found himself forced to join the conversation. His usual commanding presence felt awkward as he approached the group, now acutely aware that he was entering their space rather than them occupying his. "Perhaps," he said, clearing his throat, "we should discuss this in my office." It was an attempt to reassert control, to move the conversation to familiar territory where mahogany furniture and industry awards could reinforce his authority. But the suggestion fell flat as the group remained focused on Lyla's napkin diagram. Lyla looked up at him, her expression professional but unwavering. Actually, Mr. Hastings, I think everyone might benefit from hearing about the community center initiative. She turned slightly to include him in the circle, neither submissive nor confrontational. It aligns perfectly with what we were discussing about sustainable development. Tyler found himself nodding, though he had no idea what community center she was referring to. His head was spinning slightly from the scotch, but more so from the surreal situation. He was agreeing with his housekeeper in front of his business associates, and somehow that seemed like the only reasonable thing to do. The community center project, Lyla continued, could serve as a pilot program. It would provide vocational training, childcare services, and small business incubation space. The return on investment wouldn't just be financial, though those projections are solid. It would create a sustainable model for community-driven development. Tyler watched as she pulled up detailed statistics on her phone, displaying thorough research he wouldn't have expected. The numbers made sense, embarrassingly good sense. It was the kind of project that could transform his company's reputation from just another profit-hungry developer to a pioneer in sustainable urban development. Of course, he heard himself saying, trying to sound like he'd been aware of this all along. We've been considering various community initiatives. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them, and he caught a few knowing glances exchanged among his guests. Lyla smoothly incorporated his comment while redirecting the conversation toward concrete action steps. The existing community organizations are ready to partner, she explained. They just need the right investment structure and genuine commitment from corporate partners. The emphasis on genuine commitment wasn't lost on Tyler. His usual approach of throwing money at problems while maintaining distance suddenly seemed shamefully inadequate. He noticed Marcus Chun studying him, clearly assessing whether he was capable of this new kind of leadership. The key, Lyla continued, is understanding that true community development isn't about charity. It's about partnership and mutual growth. She outlined a structure that would provide both profit and social impact, making Tyler's previous development plans look embarrassingly short-sighted. Tyler's attempts to appear knowledgeable about his own community's needs only highlighted how disconnected he'd been. Each time he tried to assert his authority, Lyla's genuine expertise became more apparent. His arrogance was being stripped away layer by layer, replaced by an uncomfortable self-awareness. The evening was becoming a lesson in humility that Tyler had never expected to receive, especially not in his own home, at his own party, from his own housekeeper. And as the conversation continued, he began to realize that this transformation of power dynamics was far from over. The party had reached that point in the evening where social masks typically begin to slip. For Tyler, it felt like his entire facade had already crumbled. He found himself standing alone near a window, watching his usual social circle orbit around Lyla like planets around a new sun. The isolation was foreign to him. At every previous gathering, he had been the gravitational center, the one commanding attention. Now, he felt like a displaced monarch watching his kingdom reorganize itself without him. The crystal tumbler in his hand had become less of a prop and more of a crutch. "Quite something, isn't it?" said Richard Montgomery, an old money banker who rarely spoke unless he had something significant to say. "Watching our preconceptions get shattered." He stood beside Tyler, both men observing the scene before them. Richard continued, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Reminds me of when I first started in banking. Thought I knew everything because of my Harvard degree and family connections. Then my secretary, a woman from the Bronx, much like your Lyla, saved our biggest account by spotting an error I'd missed. Had to swallow my pride and promote her to risk management. Best decision I ever made." Tyler listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in years. The story hit uncomfortably close to home. He watched as Lyla engaged with a group of international investors, her knowledge of global markets apparently matching her linguistic abilities. "You know," Richard mused, "I made every excuse in the book before I admitted I was wrong. Pride's expensive that way. Costs you opportunities you don't even know you're missing." He gave Tyler a knowing look before walking away, leaving him to digest the words. The evening had taken on a dreamlike quality. Tyler observed as Lyla seamlessly connected different groups of guests, creating partnerships and opportunities that he'd never imagined. She wasn't just showing off her abilities. She was building bridges between people and ideas, something he'd never considered important until now. A burst of laughter drew his attention to where Lyla was speaking with Sarah Chun, the tech CEO's wife. Sarah, who usually maintained a careful distance at these events, was animatedly discussing something with Lyla, their heads close together in genuine conversation. Tyler felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, metaphorically and almost literally, given the amount of scotch he'd consumed. His whole understanding of value and worth was being challenged. The careful hierarchies he'd built his world upon were dissolving before his eyes. He found himself studying Lyla with new eyes, seeing not just an employee, but a person of remarkable strength and determination. The way she carried herself, the confidence that came not from wealth, but from inner conviction, the intelligence that had been honed through struggle rather than privilege. It all painted a picture that was becoming impossible to ignore. The realization was simultaneously humbling and enlightening. While he had been building walls to keep people out, Lyla had been building bridges to bring people together. Her power didn't come from excluding others, but from creating connections, from lifting people up rather than looking down on them. As the evening progressed, Tyler felt increasingly like a stranger in his own home, watching as his carefully constructed world reformed itself around new values he was only beginning to understand. And the night, he sensed, still held more surprises in store. The party had begun to thin out, with guests departing in expensive cars and private drivers. Usually, this was when Tyler felt most satisfied, counting his social victories and planning his next power moves. Tonight, however, he felt compelled to do something entirely different. Tyler found himself walking toward Lyla, who was graciously saying goodbye to a group of international investors. His approach was tentative, lacking his usual commanding stride. For the first time in his mansion, he felt like the outsider seeking audience rather than the king granting one. "Lyla," he said, his voice quieter than usual. The name felt different on his tongue now, weighted with the evening's revelations. She turned to face him, her expression professional but guarded. The memory of his earlier cruel jokes hung between them like an invisible wall. "Mr. Hastings," she responded, maintaining the formal barrier he had always insisted upon. The title now felt like an indictment rather than an honor. Several remaining guests watched their interaction with poorly concealed interest, likely expecting another display of his earlier arrogance. "I wonder if we might speak for a moment," he said, struggling to find the right tone. Not an order, not quite a request. His usual script for interactions with the help seemed hopelessly inadequate for the situation. Lyla nodded, following him to a quieter corner of the room. The remaining guests pretended not to watch, but Tyler could feel their attention. His next words would either salvage or completely destroy what remained of his reputation. "Your work tonight," he began, then stopped, realizing how that sounded, as if she had been performing rather than simply being herself. "What I mean is, your knowledge, your abilities." He trailed off again, unaccustomed to giving genuine compliments rather than calculated praise. Lyla waited patiently, her composure highlighting his discomfort. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that he felt like a schoolboy struggling to apologize to a teacher. He started again, then paused, searching for the right words. The scotch had loosened his tongue, but muddled his thoughts. "I've been less than—" Another pause. The words wrong and sorry felt foreign in his mouth, like a language he had never learned to speak. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken acknowledgments. Tyler realized that everything he had prided himself on, his wealth, his influence, his supposed superiority, seemed hollow compared to the genuine respect Lyla had earned in a single evening. A few lingering guests watched the scene unfold, their presence adding weight to this moment of reckoning. Tyler Hastings, the man who had built his empire on projecting strength and dominance, found himself struggling to bridge the gap between his old worldview and the new reality that had emerged during this transformative evening. And still, there were more surprises to come, revelations that would completely reshape his understanding of power, privilege, and true worth. Finally finding his voice, Tyler spoke with uncharacteristic humility. "I owe you an apology, Lyla." The words came out rough, unpracticed. My behavior earlier this evening, and if I'm honest, since you started working here, has been inexcusable." Lyla regarded him steadily, her expression neither accepting nor rejecting his words. The last few guests lingered by the door, witnesses to this unexpected scene. The string quartet had long since packed up, leaving the room in a heavy silence, broken only by the distant sound of staff cleaning up in other rooms. "I've spent my life equating wealth with worth," Tyler continued, the truth spilling out despite his usual instinct for carefully calculated words. "Tonight has shown me how wrong that assumption was." "Mr. Hastings," Lyla responded, her voice measured, "apologies are important, but they're just words unless backed by actions." She held his gaze with quiet confidence. "Real change requires more than a moment of regret." Tyler nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "You're right. I understand that now." He glanced around his opulent ballroom, seeing it differently. "I want to do better, to be better, but I'm not sure I know how." "Change starts with recognition," Lyla said, "but it grows through action. Your influence could make a real difference in communities that need support. Not charity," she added quickly, seeing his expression, "but genuine investment in people's potential." A few remaining guests had moved closer, drawn by the unusual sight of Tyler Hastings showing vulnerability. Among them was Marcus Chun, who had earlier been so impressed by Lila's community development ideas. "I meant what I said earlier about supporting educational initiatives," Tyler said, his voice growing stronger as he found purpose in his words. "I want to put real resources behind community development projects." "Your projects," he added, acknowledging her expertise. Lila's expression softened slightly, but maintained its professional distance. "That would be a positive step, Mr. Hastings. But real change requires more than just money. It needs genuine commitment to seeing people as equals, regardless of their background or position." Tyler felt the truth of her words like a physical weight. "I want to learn," he said simply, the words feeling strange but right. "I want to understand what I've been too arrogant to see." "That's a start," Lyla acknowledged, a small smile finally touching her lips. "But remember, Mr. Hastings, this isn't about you being generous. It's about recognizing and supporting human dignity and potential, something everyone deserves." The remaining guests watched this exchange with intense interest, witnessing what appeared to be a genuine transformation in a man known for his unwavering arrogance. But even as Tyler stood there, beginning to understand the depth of his own prejudices, he had no idea that the biggest revelation of the evening was yet to come. The last guests had finally departed, leaving Tyler and Lyla alone in the vast ballroom. The cleaning staff had been dismissed for the night, a decision Tyler had made to ensure privacy for what he hoped would be a meaningful discussion about future community projects. "About that initiative you mentioned," Tyler began, settling into a leather armchair and gesturing for Lyla to sit as well. "I'd like to offer my full support. Whatever funding you need." "Mr. Hastings," Lyla interrupted gently, remaining standing. "Before we discuss any projects, there's something you should know." She reached in her uniform pocket and removed what appeared to be a business card, but as she handed it to Tyler, he realized it was much more than that. It was a private banking card from Swiss Financial Partners, embossed with the name Lyla Johnson Rothschild. Tyler stared at the card, his mind struggling to process its implications. "I don't understand," he managed to say, though understanding was beginning to dawn. "My grandmother wasn't just a housekeeper at the Metropolitan Opera," Lyla explained, her voice taking on a new authority. "She was Elizabeth Rothschild Johnson, who chose to live simply and work honest jobs after escaping Europe during World War II. She raised me to understand both privilege and purpose." Tyler's hands trembled slightly as he held the card. "You mean?" "Yes, Mr. Hastings. My net worth exceeds yours by several $billion." Lyla finally sat down, smoothing her uniform. The uniform she'd chosen to wear despite having no need to work at all. "I've spent the past 5 years working in various positions, from housekeeping to corporate offices, evaluating potential partners for my family's new social impact fund." The revelation hit Tyler like a physical blow. Every condescending remark, every dismissive gesture he'd made came rushing back with horrifying clarity. "Tonight wasn't just about teaching you a lesson," Lyla continued. It was my final assessment of whether you and your business empire could be transformed into something more meaningful than just another wealth accumulation vehicle. Tyler's world tilted on its axis. The power dynamic he'd taken for granted hadn't just been reversed. It had been an illusion all along. Why, he managed to ask. Why work as a housekeeper when you could? Because true character is revealed in how we treat those we think can't benefit us, Lyla answered simply. My grandmother taught me that wealth is a tool, not a measure of human worth. She made sure I understood that by experiencing life from all perspectives. Tyler sat in stunned silence as Lyla outlined her vision, not just for community projects, but for a complete restructuring of how wealth and business could serve society. Her family's resources, combined with her firsthand understanding of various social strata, had positioned her to create real, systemic change. So, Mr. Hastings, she concluded, standing up once more, the question isn't whether you want to fund my projects. The question is, are you ready to be a true partner in changing how business and privilege can serve humanity? Tyler looked up at Lyla, really looked at her, and for the first time saw not an employee, not even a wealthy investor, but a teacher who had given him the most valuable lesson of his life. In this moment, he finally understood that true power lay not in domination, but in the ability to lift others up, to bridge divides, and to transform systems of inequality into networks of opportunity. The night's transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. The end.